All right. Hafa de todos hamzu buena huzon. Welcome to another episode of Fanachu. I'm very, very excited for today's episode. We're going to be talking about, if you are a fan of Chamorro history books, literature, educational resources that were created to tell the stories of the Chamorro people, the history of Guam, then you are probably familiar with the Hale-ta series. The Hale-ta series. And so one of my favorite books in the Hale-ta series is right here. This is the first volume, Imam Fadzi, Who's Who in Chamorro History. It has biographies of a number of different very important figures in Chamorro history. It represented a very sort of critical and pioneering, very, very wonderful attempt to expand the way that we saw Guam history and who was worthy of being commemorated or acknowledged or recognized in Guam history. Because usually in history books, people talk about governors, generals, elected leaders, even rich people sometimes. But in this Imam Fadzi, the first book, it recognized also Tetsas. It also recognized, massacre survivors. It recognized pateras, midwives, surahanas. It even recognized my grandfather, who was a master blacksmith as well. And so the Hale-ta series has a whole number of different volumes, right? Imam Fadzi is one of the early ones, but it's sort of the series went on to produce a whole bunch more. But I'm happy to have with me here today. I see two. I don't know where my Auntie Fran went, but two people who worked on the Hale-ta series in the 1990s with the Department of CHamoru Affairs, Dr. Katherine Aguon. We have Dr. Vince Diaz, Dr. Tina Delisle, and then when she comes back into the Zoom room, my Auntie Fran Lujan, who's the curator at the PIAM, Pacific Islander Ethnic Art Museum in Long Beach. And so, Vince and Tina, I'm so glad that you're here because so many people have relied on the Hale-ta books in big and small ways to write their master's thesis, sort of to just find some history when they didn't feel like there was a lot of stuff out there. And so I'm glad that we can talk about sort of your experiences early on, working with some people who have passed on, some people who are still with us. But Sezusmasian, so how did, and whoever wants to go first can go first, but how did you first get started working for the Hale-ta series?
I think I came after you, Vince. So do you want to?
No, I think you came before me, so you go. I think you were on board already when I joined.
Okay, well, so here's where we need Fran, because Fran actually a good friend of mine. We go back to academy, and Fran recruited me, and I was really excited. This was in the early 1990s, and I think it was like 1993. I was working for the legislature at the time. I was a writer for Speaker Jyoti San Augustine, and I was so excited about it. And I remember Jyoti pulling me aside and saying, "I don't want to lose you, but this is such a good project, and I understand." And so it was like he almost detailed me to the Hale-ta, and he said, "Sigi, go. This is really important." And so, gosh, that's kind of how I got started. I remember I really, Doc Uggan took me under her wing, and of course it helped. We had the UC Berkeley connection, and And she said, "Oh, I like you already." But I was tasked with doing, this is also my favorite book, and it's because I did the research for this, and it's really what really got me going on Chamorro oral histories.
So once they decided that UC Berkeley wasn't up to snuff, they recruited UC Santa Cruz. That's because Mike Miguel, you hadn't yet gone to UC San Diego. No, so maybe a little bit of background. The PSCC Political Status Educational Coordination Commission was created by legislation following the experiences and perspectives of people going through the political status debates and struggles of the earlier decade, 2 decades. Not that it's restricted to the 1970s and 80s, but the central idea was to educate the public about Guam's political status and its history and the challenges, particularly with an eye to capturing something of a spirit of decolonization, but also advancing what an indigenous Chamorro perspective would look like in history, in Guam's history and civics and society materials. The focus was on K-12 materials, and there was a strong understanding that the histories that had been written, if not written by non-Chamorros, and I should be clear that I'm not Chamorro, so we can discuss that, how that comes to be there. But if not written by non-Chamorros, would have still maintained a certain perspective, a certain convention about how we think about the past. So this is my understanding. As I had just finished a PhD in Santa Cruz and had been hired to teach Guam history, Pacific history, and do research at Micronesian studies. I was actually detailed. Half of my load was to do the work of what Doc Aguon used to call, with some affection, I hope, the commission's resident historian. My job was basically to work with a crew of writers and researchers, that most of whom were teachers in the K-12 system. And an earlier group had mapped out what kinds of texts. So my role was to sort of help in that project of coordinating and writing and researching what a history that would be attentive to questions of colonialism, and what would a Chamorro perspective on that history look like. So PSCC was the first public project that sought to do something like that, and it was a formidable one. And it was there's no real models. There was good scholarship by Chamorro scholars, Robert Underwood, of course, and Loling Souter and Penny Bordallo. They had already begun to rethink how you think about Guam's history, Guam's past, as you center indigenous people, indigenous Chamorro perspectives. But those were dissertations and monographs, and not public educational materials, certainly not for K-12. So I was asked Actually, I was asked not by the commission, but a writer, Joey Munoz, who teaches at GCC, I think still. Joey's a good friend of mine. We grew up together playing ball, and he was one of the writers, and he had put together a bibliography, and I had just gotten back, and he asked me if I'd take a look at it and if I'd offer anything else in it. And I said, sure, absolutely. So send it. He sent me the bibliography. I looked at it, and it was a good starter. But there was really a lot more things to add on there, um, both historical and other sources. So I gave that to Joey, and then he said, you should be working with the commission. And so he's the one that it's his fault, really, with respect to me. He's the one that kind of brought me in, and Doc Aguon and the commission uh, took a look at my CV and interviewed me, and I was really honored. That's how I came to that project, and I stayed on from '92 to about '98.
Oh, wow. Let's Sidus Master Hamza Nudos. So let's take it back for people a little bit, because I think a lot of days, or excuse me, nowadays, there's more out there. The University of Guam has an active press, and it's taking scholarly things and then things that were made by scholars and putting it out there for the larger community. But what was it like in the 1980s in terms of what were the things that people were reading at that time? Were they still reading Carano and Sanchez? Was Guam Guahan big? So what was it like out there? What was the landscape in terms of resources that you can recall?
Tina, you want to take that, or do you?
I think those two texts were very yes, those were my understanding, they were the go-to. I think Rob Rogers's book came in the 1990s, Vince, but in the 1980s, I know Dr. Sauter's book was first published by Mark in the early 1980s. So there wasn't a whole lot, but except for Dr. Sauter's book, right, which was doing something very different from the what is understood as the conventional or canon, if you will. So this was a really big deal, and my understanding is there were in conversation with Dr. Underwood and Dr. Sauter many years ago, there were these attempts to collect oral histories. Some of them were lost. I had heard about, have you heard about that? Did you hear about that, Maguette, with one of the projects that Dr. Sauter was on oral history? Many of those were lost, unfortunately, right?
And she mentioned to me that the images, the photos of the people they interviewed are still in the GCC library, but she said that I think that the interviews themselves are gone.
And I think the late Senator Pilar Lujan had also done some oral histories, but so those efforts and then those history books.
I think it's important to recognize that it's not as if there wasn't anything. So
True. That's true.
Carano Sanchez book, Guam, what was it called? A Complete History of Guam? I think that's what it was called, or something like that. Was probably the first synthesis of available materials to give an overview general history of Guam, and that was the textbook that everybody used. After that, Pedro Sanchez created his textbook, Guahan, I think it was called, right? It's been a while, honestly. We just know it how it looks, and that was the text that was used in all of the K to 12. I don't think that the argument was necessarily that there were fundamental flaws from that. I think that one of the about that text, I certainly had strong views about limitations of those texts, but I also developed ideas about general histories in particular, and the limitations of especially academic and professional trained kinds of official ways of thinking about the past, whereas I was coming from a broader indigenous studies background, um, that actually led me to a, a an, a kind of history of ideas doctorate program that was actually much more broader than simply training people to do professional history. So when you're talking about indigenous in Pacific studies, for example, one of the influential articles I read when I was in grad school in taking courses in history at University of Hawaii, uh, an article about an old man from Kiribati who would take out a skull and listen to what the skull would tell him about the past. And I took that seriously, and I still think about the idea of history as something much, much, much bigger. History in critical circles, we often talk about it, history with a capital H. That's the idea of professional, official, conventional idea that there is a definitive past and you have to follow certain procedures to capture that, and you got to be trained to do that, and the the place to find your evidence for the past is in the archives, and it's written. I mean, it doesn't take it's not hard to understand indigenous people who write differently than that, who write with tattoos, who have orature, for example, who dance and sing notions of the past. And so we contrast history with a capital H with history with small h's, the many other different ways that one can conceptualize a past, including thinking about the past that's yet to come. And so non-linear, cyclical kinds of histories, and so I was very much into that kind of stuff at the time, and still very much so. I also was thinking a lot about history from the vantage point of canoes, the materiality of the canoes, and the knowledge that's needed for not only building that but for navigation. What can that teach us about thinking about the past in really different ways? So I brought that. There was no pretense that I was bringing a Chamorro perspective, but I brought what I thought was different ways of thinking about the past that would be made possible by the most fantastic thing about the Hale-ta series was working with the commissioners. There was a really, really rich selection of educators, language people, practitioners, all of that. And I had also just come from a PhD program that was pretty abstract, high critical theory, and it was not grounded certainly wasn't grounded in a Chamorro-based perspective of Guam's past. My critical work, as some of you might know, really, really scrutinized conventional sources in the telling of the mission story, for how it's been structured, but how it also forecloses on other ways of thinking about the past, things like that. So really, I was really indebted to the experience, because day in and day out, the ideas that we were working with the writers and the researchers was also being word for word scrutinized by the commission. I know that I was under no pretense that this was going to be a definitive history, and there really I don't even buy something like that. I like multiple perspectives and even contradictory perspectives. But so I often saw my role as nudging in the direction of moving past a certain convention. Like one of the things that struck me was when I was reading early drafts from the writers was certain stock phrases that just almost unconsciously became picked up and assimilated. And so it's almost like if one is tasked with writing about history, you're supposed to even accept down lock, stock, and barrel, even phrases. Like
Mhm.
the Marianas fell on the lap of, I don't remember the details anymore. One that I always remember is and Magellan sailed past the straits that now bear his name. I mean, you don't have to say it that way, and saying it that way already predisposes you to a certain kind of heroic idea of one man's, that kind of thing. So I found my role was a lot like kind of saying, what do you think Chamoru would say about Magellan? Instead of paraphrasing what other historians have written, things like that. So to me, when I think back of those years, the really the best thing was seeing how critical ideas that I had and seeing how people were making an effort to articulate this alternative decolonial Chamorro perspective was how those were being considered and thought about by the commission. That was like incredibly rich. It was very early on that I realized, I had a contract to publish my book, my dissertation, almost as it was. And I knew that it was weak because it was not grounded. It was steeped in theory. I was actually trying to make some sophisticated arguments about, about a kind of, I won't get into the details, but a kind of post-structuralist or post-colonial critique of Guam's history when there wasn't even an anti-colonial perspective written. It was like there was just no traction. And so the first thing I learned very, very quickly was grad school that really did not prepare me for this stuff, and that stuff has to be worked out on the ground by the people themselves. So that meant that I had to table the book until I had a better understanding of Guam's political history and cultural history that came out of the Hale-ta series.
Mhm.
And that's why it took so long for that book to come out.
Thank you for bringing that perspective, and then also just I think, and remember, if you have any questions or comments for Vince and Tina, put favor, please put them message. You can message me, or you can put them onto any of the live streams, because this is on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And remember that if you comment on this episode on any of the live streams, you will be entered into a raffle. I have a few titles from the Hale-ta series with me, and so I'm going to be giving some of them away to whoever comments on the live stream. I've got the blue Hale-ta book, Mamfadzi Part 2 right here. And so remember, comment, and then I'll add your name to the raffle. But you mentioned some of the commissioners who you worked with, and it's you've already mentioned Dr. Katherine Aguon as being essential in this, but Tina, who are some of the other people that you worked with? I know that, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead and finish. You know that.
Because it's, and I'm eager to hear about this, because so many of them are important names, in the political history, the social history of Guam. So
I one of the mayors, well, one of the mayors that it was from Agate, from Huggett, with Babauta. And for me, it was, for me, what was really this is one of the highlights for me. Meeting people in the community, some of the political leaders, but just meeting the historians. Tony Palomo had just a wealth of knowledge. Some of the educators, Bill Polino, Vince, you can help me here. Name some of the
Carmen Casper Bauer, John Salas, Robert Underwood was in there for a while. Hope Alvarez Cristobal, of course, was one of the members. Tony, of course, was the chair of Doc Aguon was the director of the commission, but Tony was the chair of the board, if I'm not mistaken, and rightfully so. He wrote an oral history of the Japanese occupation, right, of Guam, and so that was one of the canon as well. So certainly that the work of PSCC wasn't simply to say that there was nothing available that was good. Hardly. We were also very much building on work that had begun to come out. So thanks for putting that up. Some of the writers, Kathy Galt was the editor and staff writer, really the supervisor of the writers and the editor. She got every manuscript whipped up and ready for meetings where the commission sat down with this pile of papers and read line by line, and most of the time stopped and talked about word for word and what they thought. Kathy Galt, the late Arlena Santos Potts was a teacher who was also one of the writers. Ron Santos, Francis Lujan, Jeannie Diaz Munoz was a staffer. I'm just reading that. John Birch was one of the writers. Jan Furukawa was one of the writers. And Hattori had started in it and then went off to do her PhD. But she was certainly one of the early writers there.
Yeah.
And there was others. There's others that cycled around.
Dispensa,
go ahead, Tina. Oh, Dispensa, go ahead.
were you going to ask a question there?
Oh, no. I was just saying it's like an all-star team.
That's
it's so good to see this.
Yeah.
So, the late Senator Pilar Lujan, Terry Hagan.
Those meetings. If I remember correctly, the board would meet once a month, and those meetings lasted several hours.
3, 4, 5 hours
on a Friday afternoon. I just remember that it going on for hours, and time would fly. So the process was really interesting in terms of who the commission felt needed to be included in at least the first Iman Fadzi. And it was just I remember that process. Who were the people that needed to be written about? Do we should and I was the researcher and writer, and so did the commission want to include people that were had passed on, who were living? I think most of these in that first volume, it was, there were people who were still alive for, at the time. I got to interview, this is one of the highlights for me, was interviewing my uncle, Dick Taitano. And, went back and interviewed him several times about political status. And it was just an opportunity for them to really talk about things that were about their life. If it wasn't specifically about political status, it was just, tell me what you want to tell me about your life and Guam history.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. I what I love about the Hale-ta the Hale-ta series, especially the early on, the Imam Fadzi, the first one, is that it really did, as Vince was saying, it really expanded our sense of history, of how we could write about history, who we could honor, and then also what we could honor them for, right? So I think that even by the 90s, sort of
I think we lost your mic.
Let's see. We might have to leave and come back in.
Let's give it a little.
Yeah, give it a
few
little bit.
moments.
Yeah.
Shall we come back in again? Shall I? Oh, there you go.
Oh, there.
dispense,
Yeah.
dispense it up. Sorry about that. The Wi-Fi, but I was just saying that because it's funny because you mentioned Pedro Sanchez, A Complete History of Guam, and Paul Carano, but as the joke always goes, it's a very incomplete history of Guam, right? And so what I loved about this, the first Imam Fadzi in particular, is that it expanded the view of who could be recognized as playing an important role in history. It brought it down to the community level, but it also pushed it out of sort of the very American assimilationist ideas of history too, right? That sort of somebody who, like the sort of Martin Luther King Jr. civil rights, right? That you're a champion because you're pushing for equality in the United States, where the first Imam Fadzi book honors a bunch of people who were pushing for equity. It wasn't necessarily that they wanted to kind of give everything up and join the United States. It was that, a lot of them were the first people to articulate Chamorro rights, sort of in public discourse, that Chamorros have rights as an indigenous people. And so that's what I found really profound, is that when I first picked up the Hale-ta book, of course, my grandfather showed it to me because he's in it. And so we would have a copy on display in his shop in the Chamorro village. But then when I remember when I was taking your Guam history class, Vince, and I looked through it and I was like, oh my goodness, some of these people were troublemakers. Some of these people were rabble rousers. And it definitely changed my personal assumptions about sort of, well, what are Chamorros like? What have they done in the past? Is our history really one simply defined by going to church and barbecuing? Or is there something more to that? And so, but yes, so, and you feel free to chime in. I'm sorry that my Wi-Fi cut out, and so I got disconnected there.
No, that's okay. So certainly some of the earliest books. Well, first of all attempts to write history will bear the marks of their moment. Everybody does that, and you can see that with the Hale-ta series too. What was understood as the general history of the island was absolutely produced within a moment of sort of celebrating a new era for Guam under America. And we understand that. We understand that because of the horrors of the Japanese occupation. But we know that life under the United States before the war was a lot more complicated than simply a sleepy island people just kind of under Spanish sway waiting until modern progress comes to the island and then just signs on. In some ways that's the sort of story, the conventional story of the 20th century, and it's not so much a wrong story because the Japanese occupation really did sort of level everything. And when people come out of the rubble, they look around and America's the victor. America has always espoused democracy and all kinds of good stuff. And there was largesse, but we also know that from work of critical historians like Robert and Lowling and Penny Hochschneider, that it was a little more complicated than that, right? It's there was pushback. There was a lot of things that was not explicitly oppositional. Not that there wasn't opposition or resistance or hesitation, all of that. But the conventional stories tended to tell a celebratory, singular story of capitulation, as almost part of an inevitability of that's what happens. People who are simple natives will eventually get swept up in the tide of historical progress, and to the extent that America
Of
represents
destiny.
that, yeah, destiny.
Of
Destiny's
destiny.
another history there that came up around the same time that we were writing. So,
And so we have some questions that have come in. Let me ask. Let me get to some of them. And so, here's one. So, whatever became of the Hale-ta series? And it seems like it was tied to the political status discussions and education, right, with Commonwealth. But then, was there ever an effort to bring it into the schools, to change curriculum and stuff like that?
I can share what I understand, but we also left in 2001. I know that that there was a sort of mixed record of times when the DOE adopted it. I think DOE did adopt it officially. It was part of the curriculum. How the teachers reacted to it and taught it, I don't know. I never really never had the opportunity to see how that. I imagine there would be some people who would be reticent to do that, because the political history, for example, there's some bold claims there that is Tony Palomo told me once, Vince, it's not that it's not that what you're saying is wrong, or people don't feel that, but we just don't say that in public. I think it's something. I think that was one of the early discussions around using the word colonizer. And I remember thinking, colonizer is not name calling. It's an analytical term. It's a condition. It's a political condition and a structure, and we need to call. It's a descriptor, and it helps us understand things. So, it's not name calling kind of thing, but there was strong language. There was strong language in there. So I don't know how the teachers reacted to it. I imagine there was a variety of things, sentiments, and so maybe they didn't use it, or maybe they did. I've certainly met a lot of former DOE public school students who went on to grad school who do remember it and mention it. Some of those texts were used at UOG as well.
No, Sidus Masen. Tina?
My understanding is very similar to what Vince said. I do know. So I was at PSCCC from 93 to 96, and I know that it had been adopted, but there were always, and I don't know, I don't have the details on this. I do know, I can say that, there was some frustration on the part sometimes, and I don't want to misrepresent Doc Uggan, but, in terms of getting it out, because this is something that people were supposed to be excited about, DOE adopting, and And I remember this, and I visualize going into the rooms. And we moved from UOG Dean Circle number, I think it was house number 1, Dean Circle, and we were Political Status Education Coordinating Commission. And then we moved, we became the it was the Chamorro Heritage Institute when we moved to Tizan, and we were at a house there. And I remember walking into the offices, the back rooms, boxes of books. So they weren't moving as fast as, we want, the commission and as fast as the Institute wanted to see them go. And I don't know, without getting into the details, why they weren't moving. But what I heard a lot of was that people were getting their hands onto them from even the bookstores. So, Faith Bookstore, the other bookstore that I'm just kind of drawing a blank on.
Bestseller.
Unban Ayade dispensa bestseller. But yeah, that's where a lot of people were getting them and sending them off island to relatives. So
somewhere along the line there was the move from PSCCC to an institute, the Heritage Institute. I don't know what that entailed operationally. I don't know why that happened, and if the status of the books sort of was bound up with that with the politics of that kind of stuff, so that's certainly something that really ought to be looked at actually and understood. But then there was also a process of folding the creation of the Chamorro Heritage Institute, and or the I'm sorry, the what was the
Department of
the Department of CHamoru Affairs, right?
Right.
That was the new thing.
Mm-hmm.
So somewhere along the line there, you have to track the relationship between those agencies and DOE within the realities of local politics. Somewhere in there's also the sheer responses, the range of responses, for better or for worse, of teachers and administrators to an effort that tried to do something different, and questioned and tried to give a different perspective on a different take on how to think about that.
As well as the shift in administration too, I believe. I remember, right?
That could have also,
and
so that's what many other things right back home that get swept up in the vortex of the local politics. Right.
Yes, I think and yes, we have Kevin Camacho who's tuning in. Hey, Sidus Masi Kevin. He says Guam history while I was a public school student was lackluster and mediocre at best. And he also wants to know, how should we approach revitalizing our Chamorro history curriculum in public schools? He says that he recalls using the Hale-ta books in high school with Dr. Katherine Aguon at UOG. He says he loved the series and the approach to telling our local history. But he says that also he got the feeling that sort of the books, their politics were involved, so it became controversial, and that's why in some ways it wasn't used.
Yeah, I think that's right. Thank you, Kevin. It's good to hear from you and that perspective. Yeah, well, right at the outset, it already announces itself unapologetically as political, right? So there's a lot of people who will already bristle at that, or just like, be really careful. Oh, that's political. And there's a conventional understanding that history is really just objective, and if you do any kind of revision, that's a sin. That's that's just ideological.
That's
And
right. That brings up memories of when we were trying to promote the books at the Guam Shopping Center, formerly
they were
Gibson's,
pretty.
right? and
There
and
are people who
oh yeah, there I
well,
remember this now, and thank you, Kevin, because I remember a few people walking by and scoffing, saying, calling it revisionist history.
yeah. There was one morning when Doc gave me a call. There was a letter written to her from an observer commentator. Um, I won't say the name because I might mistake, but I think you guys would know at least a type. Who was just blasting the series because it was just political and revisionist and anti-American and all of that kind of stuff. And Doc was really concerned, and rightfully so, but because you want the product to be credible. I certainly don't think I just produce propaganda. I don't think like that, for all of the multiple perspectives, it's still evidence based. And so I asked her, so in this letter, can I see it? And did, other than name calling, did the person take on any specific claim as erroneous? And what was the counter to that? And there was absolutely none. So, I've seen academic articles, and Hattori has written articles that's interrogated shortcomings of the series, and that's what we should be getting. I totally agree with that. Because the history of the people should always be interrogated by the people for the shortcomings and for the history always has to. History is not set. It's not set in the past is not set in stone. It's just not in a definitive way. That's propaganda.
No, very true. I think it is interesting how people in Guam have, because of how these ideas come into the island, they accept sort of that there is that universal capital H history. And they also accept sometimes that they are the victims or on the outside of it, that they don't produce it. Or this is one thing that, that when I was working with Jose Torres and the men of Malesso who fought the Japanese, the question that I always asked people was, well, why is it that the people of Malesso didn't come together to honor those who killed the Japanese? They came together to honor those who died at the hands of the Japanese. And it is one of those just interesting questions of history and who gets to be the subject of history, who gets to be the agent of history, right? And so the Chamorros were very comfortable with being the victims of history because so much around them seemed to always imply that. But when it came to a story in which they were the heroes, it became muddled, in which some families were super proud of it, but then others sort of, it couldn't ever achieve something greater, but everyone could unify around honoring victims, honoring the United States. But when it came to honoring Chamorros, it was just, it didn't fit. It didn't fit at that time. It didn't fit at that time. And so I can definitely sort of, I can definitely see some of that at play in here as well, why people would, some would resist the Hale-ta series, right? Because nowadays they use critical race theory to talk about it. And say that, oh, no, that stuff is just critical race theory. And it's funny because when it's Chamorros who say it, I'm always like, yeah, but critical race theory is good for us. It's going to tell our story. It's going to get past all the BS and talk about the stories that have been silenced or suppressed. But it's like, no, history belongs with Christopher Columbus at the top. History belongs with Magellan at the top. History has to be told beneath a big statue of Salvatoris. That's how history is supposed to work. And so,
no,
yes,
I think that's, and I think, but also leave some room for just some real complicated, contradictory kinds of things. Tina wrote a really interesting article a few years ago about taking on the position of writing as a daughter, writing a tradition of Tumugi Papa, right? Writing down her grandmother's stories and but if you think about a place like Guam and history as residing in family narratives, for example, to speak of history is to already then privilege certain family narratives and run the risk of not speaking of other families.
Mhm.
That puts you in a real deep conundrum. And then there's another thing that I think is very prominent in indigenous historiography circles. This idea that if you're a native, you somehow have a, a more direct line to a more authentic narrative of the past. But actually, if you're a native writing the past, that's even, I would argue that's even infinitely harder than, because of precisely because of all the obligations and responsibilities that come with that, and because you're not supposed to speak of, you don't have the status to speak for other families. So it's already going to be inherently partial and arguably contested. And maybe that's maybe that's how history ought to be. And so how do we write histories that honor the contradictions and the tensions without looking at those things as somehow taboo or beyond the pale? Like, why does history have to be resolved in one direction? Almost always a colonizing perspective direction, but or an anti-colonial one. I don't say this to dismiss it. I'm still committed to what an and decolonial perspective would look like. But what if the history involved a lot of people who didn't oppose that and actually found interest in the colonial perspectives? How do you write about that? There's a tendency to not talk about that because it's yucky or messy.
Oh, a very good point. A very good point. The Kipua conundrum. So, Tina, did you want to talk about Tumugi Motna or anything else? Because yes, that's a really, that really connects to sort of the larger, Hale-ta push sort of to reimagine these sorts of things. And so did you put for what?
So I think what I think what Vince is referring to is in writing Hale-ta and trying to honor our ancestors and the unsung. That's how Doc Guggen like to put it, as well as the board, right? The unsung heroes and heroines. The stories were to uplift, right? And for the youth. I mean, the Hale-ta, the Iman Fazi was supposed to really be for middle school, and at the middle school level, and the stories were not meant to really get at the complexity. Obviously, is geared toward middle schools, and so when I wrote when I was writing about what it meant to write things down, for family, reckoning with family history, writing those things down, and not always representing the romantic feel good stories, right? But what does it mean to show the complex stories? That's the kind of histories that I would. This is this, right? The placental politics book, and writing a different narrative about the patera, for example, and showing the things that it's in Iman Fadzi, it was writing about the people who didn't get into those canonical histories, but then taking it, the next step would be about writing about the complexities of the patera stories, in the stories of the nurses. What I loved about, Maget, to what you were saying earlier about it being expansive. I mean, that's absolutely right. In the section on, as we know, those who we look at the archives, we don't see the women in there, and we don't see the names of Chamorro women in the Spanish accounts. So how do you begin to write that, right? And we collectively thought, even giving it a category, right? And Vince was involved in this process too. We didn't have a name, right? And maybe we want to get away from the centering of the men and the political leaders, but the woman from Tomhom, rather than Chief Matapang's wife, right? The woman of the Ulitao. And one of the things that we struggled with was some people had saved pictures, had more documents about their family members, and then others didn't have anything, and so they couldn't, the individual chapters, the pieces on individuals, there was no way that they could be equal in terms of the same number of pages, right? And that was really indicative of Typhoon using photos. So did that mean that we didn't include them because it couldn't be 15 pages or the same amount of pages as Reverend Joaquin Sablan? No, we just had to include that, right? And I thought that was more genuine. So there we could see the limits of the Hale-ta, and we need to recognize that. Even the section on the women came under the category of women of prehistory, prehistory, right? And what does that say in terms of privileging that which doesn't get written down? Then does that not mean that it's legit history? So there are limits, but I certainly think it was the beginnings of what could really be understood as a decolonizing project, a decolonizing of history project.
Can I mention something? I think one of the glaring shortcomings of the Hale-ta series, as I was there, was we didn't have time. That we were under a pretty tight schedule. Doc really wanted these out, and there was a lot of that. But the so-called Levesque volumes that really began to make available primary source documents that did have a lot more detail than a lot of the stuff that we were not equipped to deal with Spanish transcripts. I could read Spanish, but that's still at a level that I'm not qualified to really take on the 16th, 17th, 18th century. My work is known for close readings of text, and I don't have that ability to do that with Spanish documents. It was really only in the same period that the Levesque volumes were beginning to come out. And the verdict was still out about the quality of those translations and transcriptions. So there was no critical work that came out to tell us whether this was solid translations and complete, or he was an independent scholar who did this on his own dime and all of that stuff. So I still don't know the quality of the translations. But for that shortcoming, that doesn't erase or minimize what was still, at the end of the day, a collective effort a collective, collaborative effort to try to articulate a take on what Guam's past was if you were to center it on Chamorro perspectives and center the problem of colonialism. That had to be done. And that the Hale-ta series was the first collective effort to do that. There were individual scholars who did that on their own. And it wasn't entirely on their own. I don't want to shortchange, for example, that edition that Robert and Laura Sauter put together on Chamorro self-determination. That was a collective thing, and there you had different authors in there. So that's definitely part of the counter historiography. I was inspired by that work. Those are the ones that shaped how I understood the work that I did. You know, I certainly liked to think that the work I was doing was informed by them and in dialogue with them. The Hale-ta was an even broader based collective to try to articulate those things.
No, Sidus Masi, we're just about out of time, but I wanted to give you each a chance to sort of share some final thoughts. We've got a lot of comments and a lot of support from people watching who feel inspired by this. Even some people sharing that perspectives on Magellan, Matapang, and sort of when they first read a Hale-ta book. Andrew Gumatauta, who's in a PhD program, says at Bishop Baumgartner, Anne Marie Arceo was his teacher, and that's the first time he read a Hale-ta book. And so, Sidus Masi, to all of you who are watching and tuning in, and to one of the questions before I hand it off for some final thoughts, there is a move, a project with UOG Press right now to create social studies textbooks that are locally and regionally focused. And so Robert Underwood is writing the 5th grade. I'm writing 4th grade. Dr. Laura Sauter is writing one. Elissa Santos is writing another one. And so it's we're building off of the work of Hale-ta because, you know, one of the things that we've seen, unfortunately, is that, you know, that if you create these great books, if the system around it that sort of is receiving these books is antagonistic to that or resistant to that for whatever reason, right? Similar to the way in which, you know, some people may say, oh, a real history has to be in a book, or a real education has to happen in a classroom, right? The assumptions about what it has to be. And I think that for a lot of the educational system, you know, it's kind of like the local component can be a Carabao ride, or it can be sort of learning to weave a katupat, or maybe you make some Kelagwan manuk, and that's the local component, right? The Hale-ta series kind of sought to change things, especially in social studies and history. Like, how do you learn, how do you teach these things? And I think in a lot of ways, the system, whether administrators or teachers, weren't ready for that, whether because of their background in sort of an American education system, their own sort of personal preferences, but that's one of the things that I sort of see in that. But for those of you who are hoping for something different, I think all of the textbooks are almost done. And now there are graphic artists who are working with illustrators to sort of fill them with a lot of graphs and nice pictures. But so keep on the watch for that on the horizon. So Tina, go ahead. I wanted to give you both a chance to sort of share some final thoughts.
Tina, you're muted.
If you wouldn't mind, I wanted to show rather than, but if you, Cosina, share screen.
Oh, sige. I just changed it so you can share.
Okay. So. Oh, is that coming out big enough? Can you see that?
Again.
I thought you might appreciate that. That was in 1995. you know, this is something that my my grandmother and my mother were so proud of me because we would go out to you know, if we went to a Lasatzu and my grandmother and my mom would be, hey, Sitina, she knows all the manamku, right? I was hanging out with the manamku because of all the, you know, the interviews that I was doing. So it was really special, and I just wanted to that was one of the highlights for me, was just being able to spend time with the elders. And that was just, that would tickle my grandmother when we would go somewhere and she would be, how did you know you know, how did you know Mrs. So and so, right? Oh well, because I interviewed her, you know. And so yeah, I just wanted to share that.
It's just Mose. Oh, Mahaling Zupadagwits. I miss my grandfather so much. And so
Yeah.
this definitely talking about this series, you know, and he was so proud to be included in this because it kind of it's one thing, you know, that, you know, because elders would be invited to demonstrate for Chamorro Week, go to the Micronesian Island Fair, but then to be put into a book like that. And then for my grandfather, who, you know, was sort of to have himself listed along with people who were senators and governors and stuff like that, it for, you know, for him, even though he may not admit it, it was definitely a big honor sort of to be amongst the Manaculunai.
Yes, yes.
But Sidus Masitina, and so either of you, sort of your final thoughts on this, the Hale-ta series, and how it you know, how it shaped you, or sort of you've already shared some stuff, but anything that you would like to share before we go. Vince, go ahead.
Yeah, really quickly, that the two most important things that ever happened to me that continues to shape the kind of scholarship I do, the kind of critical stuff I do, for better or for worse. The two of this was the Hale-ta series when I got back home, and being involved in that process to really ground the complexities of that history that I was interested in understanding, and the canoe work. And you know, we left in 2001 not thinking that we're going to be gone this long, you know, but that that 1-2 punch of the revitalization of canoe knowledge and the Hale-ta processes continues to be a really, 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 really important foundation for how I think about, how I process a lot of stuff, you know. And so uh, it's more than gratitude. It's for me, the sentiments are just a really deep sense of honor for having been invited, you know, and being privy to a generation of highly respected people talking about their heritage, their history, their, you know. And there was often times when it really, there was a lot of bantering going on, but there was also jokes, but there was also serious moments. You can imagine talking about World War II and or you know, the when you start getting into the messy parts. There was a little bit of that when we talk about the some of the details of the recent political history of an effort to pass a constitution that came from Congressional Enabling Act that circumscribed the process. But what did it mean that congressional legislation that circumscribed the range of possibilities for imagining Guam's political future also came from Tony Wampat and a feud he was having with the legislature? You know, that's a lot messier than, that's a lot harder to contend with than it's a lot easier to say those colonizers in Washington, D.C. So it was really interesting to hear PSCC folks talking about that and trying to process that. And, again, I don't think we came away with definitive truth. I don't buy that kind of thing, but I know that my thinking about a lot of other things was definitely shaped by that experience.
Sidus Masin. And Tina, your final concluding thoughts?
I think I'm gonna share this. I say this. I wrote this in Placental Politics. That the Hale-ta project really had a really profound impact on how I think about history, and I attribute that to Hale-ta in the book. From how I think about what constitutes history to my love of oral histories.
Sidus Masin. Heidi, this has been as somebody who grew up, at least intellectually, as on the Hale-ta series, this has been really nice to sort of hear your reflections, also hear stories about those that you worked with in creating it, because I think for many younger scholars, people such as Katherine Aguon, Tony Palomo, even Bill Paulino, Pilar Cruz, Lujan, others, who some of them are still around, but it's just, it's important to kind of sort of bring them to life for the next generation, right? And one thing that I think I really enjoyed about our conversation today was sort of that if it is our history and if it's as real as it can get, then it's got to be complicated. If it's simple, either in a way that you like or in a way that you don't like, it means that it's not real. It's not even close to real yet, right? And so I think that that's one thing that the Hale-ta series definitely helped to remind us about, is that you could rewrite the history against everything the colonizers have said, but that doesn't mean that you're closer to telling the Chamorro story. Just because you do that, you may be telling a side of it, but you have to accept the Kepua conundrum. Some Chamorros converted, and that's and Kevin Camacho says, great thesis idea. That's true. Somebody should write a whole thesis on Kepua.
Waiting for you, Kevin.
Yeah, at least you have some options here with the resident historian.
But you're right. I mean, Miguel, you're really right. The Chamorros deserve much more than a caricature. There's value to that for introducing and for getting, and if you need a caricature that has been a portrait, or a caricature, a simplified enough portrait that has been erased, then you got to do that. But that's not the definitive. That it's an ongoing project.
Again. For those of you watching, remember, place a comment. I have a couple Hale-ta books here. I'm gonna write down everybody's name, and then I'm gonna put it into a little woven basket. And then next week or the week after, I'm gonna pull them out, and you might win a free copy of one of the Hale-ta series. All right. And now para pago, Sidus Masi no hamzo no dos, Sidus Masi no hamzo todos ni omega. Adios, hasta aquí.
Yes.